As I wrote this sermon for our Veterans Day, Armistice Day commemoration this morning, I thought of my grandfather who fought in World War I, my father who fought in World War II. And I commend to you that perhaps if you had fathers or brothers or grandfathers or uncles or cousins who fought in either of those wars or any war, that you hold them in your mind and in your heart while I'm preaching and as we continue our prayers. Well, World War I ended on November 11th at 11 a.m. on that day in 1918, right? 100 years ago at this very hour. It was the war, as Mr. Wilson said, to end all wars. And yet 20 years later, we were engaged in another war that did not end all wars, but has begun a war that it appears continues to this very day in one form or another. Some 20 million people were killed in the course of the First World War. The League of Nations was established in order to prevent further war, but failed. The League of Nations failed because the United States refused to join. There's a great poem from World War I written by John McCrae, who was a Canadian, a physician, and served in World War I. And that poem is In Flanders Fields. I'm going to read it to you now. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark the place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. Today is also Veterans Day. We honor the men and women who have served this nation in all its wars, from the Revolutionary to Afghanistan. Men and women, sometimes children, certainly animals, dogs, horses. All have served this nation in their own way. And we honor those loyal citizens who serve today in the armed forces of this nation spread abroad, including those who have been ordered to the United States and Mexico border to await an unarmed caravan of refugees. Today we join other churches across the nation in tolling our bells in memory of those who died. And in thinking of those who died, there is another poem. It was written by the dean of another cathedral, John Donne, who was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, London. The poem John Donne wrote, he said, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Dunn's point is that when one suffers, we all suffer. That we cannot consider war in an isolated or abstract or remote way. When one suffers, all suffer. And we cannot speak of war without speaking of peace. We will soon exchange the peace as part of our service. But for the Christian, peace is not simply the absence of conflict. For the Christian, peace is a greater reality than simply absence of difficulty or conflict. Peace for the Christian is certainly an end to war, but peace is also the presence of a larger reality. Peace in the Christian mind is that in the midst of conflict, we know a presence that is greater than the conflict. That in the midst of conflict, we lean on the risen Christ to show us not the easiest way out, but the most loving way out. And often the most loving way out is filled with sacrifice and conflict. All great leaders point to this reality. Jesus, Paul, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mandela, they all point to peace as being the presence of a larger reality. And yet we would also have to say, and they didn't lead very peaceful lives, but they knew something. They knew something that we need to listen to and heed in their own lives. That peace is presence. Peace is the presence of the risen Christ. There's a hymn in the Episcopal Hymnal. It's number 661, if you want to look it up. It's a hymn about God's peace. It starts with the words, "They cast their nets in Galilee." And in the last verse, which I'm going to read to you, there's a word that is used, sod, S-O-D, sod. It's an Old English word that means life or living. So the last verse is the peace of God. It is no peace, but strife closed in the sod. Yet brothers and sisters, pray for but one thing, the marvelous peace of God. Brothers and sisters, the peace of God is not to be found in escaping life in this broken world or yearning for some spiritual place where the ills and difficulties of life and war and peace and pain and suffering and death don't touch us as an escape from the realities of life. Peace is found in engaging life in all its glory and in all its suffering. For peace is the power to endure. Peace is the power to rest our weary and war-torn souls in the presence of the risen Jesus as we continue to work and to pray and to witness in order to end human suffering, in order to bring an end to war, in order to strive for peace among all people and all nations. And that is why we remember this day. To remember those who fought, those who died, those who served, but also to recommit ourselves to that for which they strove, and that peace, that blessed peace that comes from God alone.